Today I'm going to show you how you can paint a realistic looking rose with soft petals and silver glitter effects. Do you see the intense pink color in my watercolor box? I will use this later to paint the edges of the petals. The color is called Opera Rose and it's from Winsor & Newton. By the way, you can find all materials in the video description. The pink is particularly useful for painting flowers because it shines so intensely pink. Besides the regular watercolors, I also work with metallic paints. And for this tutorial, I'm using silver and golden watercolor paint. Oh, and by the way, this video is just a short version of the original tutorial. The extended tutorial is over an hour long with even more detailed instructions than this video has. If you want to watch the long tutorial, join me on Patreon, where you can find many more step-by-step tutorials and painting videos. You can find a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. Now, to start the study, I mix a silver tone with a bit of water and then I apply it around the rose with a large brush. I leave the calyx as it is, but paint over the leaves and stem. For this study, I want to create an abstract ground that frames the rose. Metallic watercolor paint is particularly suitable for this because it creates such beautiful glossy effects all by itself. While the paint is still wet, I mix a light shade of green and roughly paint over the rose petals. Since the surface is still wet, the color flows into the background, creating painterly abstract effects. I use two different shades of green, the more intense chromium oxide green and the brownish olive green. To enhance the abstract effects, I take some gold paint on my brush and just splash the paint onto the paper. This creates splatter effects that remind a bit of graffiti art. Here I dab off a bit of excess water with a rag. If there is too much water on the paper, it just takes too long for the paint to dry, and I'm just a bit too impatient for that. When everything is dry, we can start painting the petals. The technique I use on this rose is actually quite easy to follow. I divide the rose into its individual petals and paint each one of them separately. I make sure that I only paint petals that don't touch, otherwise the wet paint would run into each other. I start with a petal at the top left. For this I take Opera Rose and start with the edge of the petal. I also mix in a bit of burnt sienna, as the leaves have a brown undertone. I fill in the rest of the petal with a lighter version of the same color by just adding some water. And then I paint the next petal. Since the petals don't touch, the colors can't run into each other here either. For this petal I mix a grayish tone out of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Then for the edge of this petal I use pink again. Here I paint a white yellowish area, and you can see why the colors of the petals shouldn't bleed into each other. Because the upper petal is pink in color, it stands out from the lighter sheet below, and the illusion of realism is created by the distinction of these different colors. The sides of the leaves are often yellowish-brownish in color, while the surface is more pink. And so I work my way from petal to petal. I mainly work with brown tones. I use light ochre, orange and burnt sienna. Now only the top petals remain. These differ from the others in that they have bright light areas. I leave these areas white. This petal right here is all white except for the pink edge. The top petals are a bit more difficult to color in, especially as they are much smaller and have a lot of white areas that mustn't be painted over. But also it doesn't have to be perfect. Now that the paint has dried, I need to paint over each individual petal again to get the right level of shading. Now it's time to paint the details of the smallest petals. These are structured in the same way as the large ones, often with a pink border and yellowish-brown shading. Only they are all a bit smaller and therefore more difficult to paint. Particularly complex roses are best painted in large formats. I think you can clearly tell that the rose is slowly coming to life. Through all the shadings, she has already gained a convincing depth effect. Now I reinforce this by further developing the shadows and painting even darker in some places. Here it is important to compare your picture with a reference. Only paint the shadows darker if they really look that dark on the reference. Although you can't see it directly, the rose has a lot of green undertones. And when I intensify this color, it helps to make the rose look more real. I like the bottom petal the best. There are so many folds and small details here, so I work them out with extra care. You should be aware of the strong effect edges have in a work of art. I pay a lot of attention to them and look carefully in my reference to see if there are still some edges or contours that I can intensify. In areas where many lines meet, there are often shadows that I can paint even darker, and that will create even more depth. The rose blossom is finally finished and I can paint the stem and the leaves now. For this study I choose to make the leaves more abstract and simplified. That's why I only mix an intense shade of olive green and fill in the leaves with it without paying attention to details. I vary my color layer by incorporating brown or silver tones. This creates a shape in which different colors can flow into each other. Here I changed the shade of green, for example. Of course, I don't want to miss my favorite splash effects. Since the green is still wet, the color can mix with the green and create an almost surreal effect. Then I take some gold on my brush and dip it into the wet areas, so that later the leaves can shimmer golden. And now I use a little trick. I put some white gouache on my palette. I can use this to enhance some selected highlights on the rose petals. Some of the shadows turned out a bit too dark, and by mixing some ochre into the white gouache, I get an opaque color that I can use to paint over some petals again and create much more even layers of paint. This radiant white gives the rose even more depth. But I'm careful not to put too much gouache on the rose because it has a very opaque effect and can easily cover the beautiful watercolor effects. With the flat side of my brush, I can even draw in individual folds in the petals. And this is the finished study. I hope you like it and you enjoyed this tutorial. I love to draw roses because they are my favorite flowers and there are so many different kinds that I never get bored of drawing them.